Hi, we'd like to talk to you today about the City of Oklahoma City's redistricting process. Every 10 years, the federal decennial census happens, and that triggers in Oklahoma City our redistricting process. There are really only two requirements in our city charter. That is for contiguity. In other words, a ward cannot have an island out away from the rest of the ward. And compactness. So in other words, trying to keep the shape as regular as we can and as compact, and that it doesn't have pieces of the ward that jut out or fingers or things of that nature. On September 28, 2021, the City Council passed a resolution that laid out the process and the criteria for our redistricting. The required criteria for redistricting are compactness, contiguity, and keeping an incumbent in their ward. And then there are some other criteria that we're allowed to consider, such as arterial streets, highways, natural boundaries, established neighborhoods, business districts, and voting precincts. Also, the variance from the average ward population of 2% was established. So in other words, once we determine what the average ward population needs to be, we would be allowed to go 2% above that or 2% below. Okay, so the 2020 census information helps us set our goals for redistricting. The new population for Oklahoma City is 681,054 residents. And if you take that and divide it by 8, which is how many wards we have now, the average ward population that we'd be shooting for is 85,132. So as I mentioned earlier, the council had adopted a plus or minus 2%, which 2% of that number is 1,703. So we could go 1,703 residents above or below the average ward population number. That gives us a range of 83,429 on the low end up to 86,835. So that's the targeted range that we would be looking at as we're going through the redistricting process to try to make sure each ward has that many residents in the ward. So step one in the charter is to take the existing ward map and apply the 2020 census population data to it. This is that map. As you can see, our wards are now unbalanced, and this officially triggers that we must do a redistricting. They range anywhere from the largest is Ward 8 at 105,619 to the smallest is Ward 6 at 68,774. As you can see from the map, Wards 8, 1, and 3 are above our targeted level. All of the other wards are below. So this is our starting point for the redistricting process. Here's a table that shows each of the wards' current population based on the 2020 census and what the amount is that they would have to subtract or add to get to the targeted number. And here is a draft map of the new wards. So let's go into the process of how we got to this draft map. So we wanted to start the process looking at compactness. Compactness is measured in different ways. There's a legal standard called the eyeball test, which is exactly what it sounds like looking at it. What does the shape look like? Does it look compact? Does it have pieces that jut out or odd shapes? And then also there are mathematical models we can look at. Two of those mathematical models that we've looked at are the Schwartzberg and the Polsby-Popper test. So you all can look at the eyeball test yourself looking at the maps. This slide has some of the results of the mathematical computations from the Schwartzberg and Polsby-Popper results. As you can see, in both cases, the city is more compact mathematically. And I would add that the goal is to try to get both of those numbers closer to 1. So let's take a look again at the draft redistricted map. This map has highlighted each of the areas of change. So now we'll take a closer look at each of these individual areas. So one of the first things we looked at were areas that had issues of compactness. This is one of the very first ones of those. This change would move 12,903 residents from Ward 1 to Ward 2. Another area that had some issues with compactness is this one. This would move 9,811 residents from Ward 3 to Ward 2. Another obvious area that had some issues of compactness was this one, And this move would change and move 11,191 residents from Ward 2 to Ward 7. So now, once we began dealing with some of the more obvious changes that had to do with compactness, we began the rebalancing process. If you recall from earlier looking at the original ward map, all of our wards on the west side of the city had more than the targeted amount. So we needed to begin moving some of those populations around. This one would move 16,577 residents from Ward 8 to Ward 1. Then, as part of the balancing process to get Ward 1 where it needs to be, we made this change, which would move 9,367 residents from Ward 1 to Ward 3. This also fixed a minor issue of compactness in Ward 3. Now we begin focusing on the population issues in some of the other wards. As you recall, Ward 6 was one of the wards that needed the most population added. So this is one of those changes that moved 9,408 residents from Ward 3 to Ward 6. The next change, again, was focusing on balancing the population. Ward 5 was pretty close to where it needed to be originally, so this change moved 3,344 residents from Ward 3 to Ward 5. Next, we moved over and had another change to add some population to Ward 6. This change would move 5,556 residents from Ward 4 to Ward 6. Then we began looking at the balancing issues with Ward 4, which also needed to have population added. So this change would add 10,107 residents from Ward 7 to Ward 4. So at this point, Ward 4 was pretty close, so we made one other minor change to take 1,869 residents from Ward 5 into Ward 4. At this point, Wards 5 and 4 were pretty good. Then we moved to our last areas we needed to balance, which were 8, 7, and 2. So this change was the first part of that moved 2,401 residents from Ward 7 to Ward 2. As we move north on the map, you can see we had one other area of compactness that we needed to deal with. This change moved 4,555 residents from Ward 7 into Ward 8. And then lastly, the final change to balance out the populations in Ward 7 and Ward 8 was this change, which moved 8,558 residents from Ward 8 into Ward 7. And that's how we arrived at our draft redistricted map. As you might recall, I talked about the council resolution from September, and there were some other criteria that we considered as we were making these changes. And those were things like looking at business districts, established neighborhoods, trying to make our changes based on arterial roads and other natural boundaries such as highways. And we did take a look at these and tried to minimize the impact to neighborhoods and business districts. So what are the next steps? At this point, you have a draft map. The next steps are for the city to get input from city council members and from you, the public. We'll be doing that through posting this information and providing a way to provide feedback on okc.gov/redistricting, as well as we will be hosting a virtual workshop and an in-person workshop. Once we receive feedback from residents and council members, all that feedback will be taken into consideration to see if there are any needed changes to our draft map. After that, the draft map will then be taken to City Council in the form of an ordinance and will be on 3 City Council meetings for consideration. That's our process. I hope it was easy to understand. Thank you for your time.